I arrived at Dad's house just before dusk, when the sky over Madison turned that soft winter gray that makes everything feel quieter than it really is. The porch lights were already on, glowing warm against the cold, and the wreath on the door looked fuller than last year. Mom had probably redone it herself, adding fresh pine and those small red berries she loved. Christmas always looked perfect from the outside at Dad's house. It always had. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and buttered potatoes wrapped around me the moment I stepped in. Rowan was already there, sitting at the dining table with her phone in her hand scrolling, smiling to herself. Dad stood near the counter, a glass of wine in his hand, already mid-story about the company, about a shipment that had been delayed, and how he personally stepped in to fix it. Mom moved quietly between the stove and the table, nodding at the right moments, never interrupting. I hung my coat, smoothed my sweater, and took my seat like I had done so many times before. Everything felt familiar, almost rehearsed. The polished wood table, the matching place settings, the way Dad naturally took the head of the table, his voice carrying without effort, the way Rowan angled her chair slightly toward him, always aligning herself with whatever he said before he even finished the sentence. Dinner began with small talk that was not really small talk at all. Dad asked me how work was going, but it was not a question. It was an opening for commentary. I answered carefully, saying things were busy, that the end of the year always was. He nodded, then immediately followed with how hard it was for everyone right now, how leadership meant making sacrifices, how some people were built for pressure and some were not. He did not look directly at me when he said it, but the words landed squarely in my lap. Mom passed the bread basket and gave me a quick glance, the kind that said, "Please do not start anything tonight." Rowan smirked and took a long sip of her drink. I kept my expression neutral and continued eating, the fork feeling heavier than usual in my hand. As the plates filled and emptied, the conversation circled back again and again to the company. Dad spoke about clients, about expansion plans, about how important loyalty was. Rowan chimed in with comments about branding and image, about how people noticed who showed up and who did not. Every time I tried to steer the conversation somewhere lighter, toward the holidays, toward memories, it drifted right back. Halfway through the meal, Dad turned to me again and asked how late I had been working this week. I hesitated for a second, then answered honestly. I said I was exhausted. I said I had been pulling long hours for months covering gaps, fixing problems, and that I was thinking about taking a few days off after Christmas to reset. I said it calmly. I said it without accusation. The table went quiet. Dad set his fork down slowly, the clink against the plate sounding louder than it should have. He looked at me, then really looked, the way he did when he was about to make a point. He said that this was not the time to step back. He said pressure was part of responsibility. He said if I could not handle it, maybe I should go live in the streets. The words landed hard, sharp, said clearly enough that there was no misunderstanding. Rowan let out a small laugh, not loud, not even amused, just dismissive. She shook her head and muttered that I was useless, barely loud enough to hear, but loud enough. At that moment, something inside me went very still. I did not feel the rush of heat or the sting behind my eyes that I might have felt years ago. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply breathed. I noticed the way the candles flickered. I noticed the hum of the refrigerator in the other room. I noticed how Mom's shoulders tensed as she stared at her plate. I smiled. Not a forced smile, not a brittle one, just a small, calm smile. I stood up from the table, pushed my chair back, and reached for my coat. Dad frowned, confused more than angry. Rowan rolled her eyes. Mom whispered my name, but I was already moving. Before I reached the door, I turned back. I said that if that was how they felt, then I guessed I should invite them to my street party. I said it evenly, like it was an afterthought, like it was nothing. They stared at me, trying to process what I meant. Rowan laughed again, louder this time, and said something about me finally losing it. Dad waved his hand like he was brushing the comment aside, already done with the conversation. Mom said nothing. I stepped outside into the cold. The door closed behind me and the sounds of the house faded. The air bit at my cheeks, sharp and clean, and I stood there for a moment, letting it ground me. As I walked to my car, the quiet settled in. Snow crunched under my boots. The sky had darkened completely, stars faint had thought visible. I sat behind the wheel and rested my hands there without turning the key. My heart was steady. My breathing was slow. If you are listening to this right now, I wonder where you are. Maybe you are in your kitchen or on your couch or driving somewhere familiar. When this happened to me, I was sitting in my car in Dad's driveway, the engine off the radio silent, just taking it all in. If this story resonates with you even a little, I hope you will stay with me. Maybe leave a comment about where you are listening from. I drove away a few minutes later, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel angry. I felt clear. For the first time in a long while, the noise in my head was gone. That night, I went home alone. I reheated leftovers, fed my cat, and sat on the couch with the lights dimmed. I replayed the dinner in my mind, not to torture myself, but to understand it. Dad's words were not a mistake. Rowan's reaction was not a joke. Mom's silence was not new. I realized then that what had happened was not an ending. It was a reveal. Dad had finally said out loud what he had always implied. Rowan had confirmed where she stood, and I had finally stopped trying to prove something to people who had already decided who I was. I slept deeply that night. The kind of sleep that only comes when you stop bracing yourself. When morning came, the house felt lighter. The sun filtered through the windows, pale and calm. I made coffee and stood by the sink, watching the steam rise. This is not a story about being thrown out. It is not a story about losing everything. It is a story about what happens when the truth slips out at the dinner table, and you finally listen to it. What Dad and Rowan did not know that night was how literal their words were. They thought the streets were an insult. They thought it meant nothing. They had no idea what those streets actually were to me, or what was already set in motion long before that Christmas dinner. When I think back to how it all began, my mind always returns to the early spring of 2020, long before the world learned how to hold its breath. Back then, I still had a life that felt separate from Dad's company. I lived across town in a modest apartment with thin walls and loud neighbors, but it was mine. I had friends I met for coffee after work routines that belonged only to me, and evenings that did not revolve around emails or emergency calls. Dad called me one night just after dinner. I remember standing in my kitchen, the sink full of dishes I had not bothered to wash yet, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. His voice sounded tired, stretched thin in that way that always made me feel like I was the only person who could help. He said the company was struggling. He said people were overwhelmed. He said things had gotten messy and needed someone who understood how everything fit together. He did not ask me directly. He did not need to. He spoke about family responsibility, about stepping up when it mattered, about how he trusted me. He told me it would be temporary, a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, just until things stabilized. I said yes before he finished explaining what that help would look like. The first day I walked back into Holt Distribution Services felt strangely familiar, like returning to a childhood home that had been rearranged without my permission. The lobby looked the same, polished floors and framed awards lining the walls, but the energy had shifted. People moved faster, talked quieter. There was an undercurrent of stress that buzzed just beneath the surface. I was given a desk near the operations floor, not quite tucked away but not front and center either. Close enough to hear every problem as it arose, far enough that no one thought twice about asking me to fix it. At first, my role was clear enough. I reviewed workflows that had grown tangled over the years. I traced bottlenecks back to their source. I sat with team leads and asked questions no one else had time to ask. When I pointed out inefficiencies, people listened. When I suggested changes, they implemented them. Then the scope expanded. When a shipment went missing, the call came to me. When a long-standing client threatened to pull their contract, I was the one asked to smooth things over. When the system froze during a critical update, I stayed late until it came back online. Dad noticed. He praised me during meetings with partners, his hand gesturing in my direction as he talked about improvements and momentum. He said things were running better now. He said it was good to have someone dependable. People nodded, impressed. Later, behind closed doors, he would sit back in his chair and tell me I needed to be careful. He said I was drawing too much attention. He said leadership meant knowing when to step back. He reminded me that I was there to support, not to replace anyone. Rowan had arrived before me that year, stepping into a role with a title that sounded important: Brand and Public Relations Manager. She had an office with a door that closed and walls decorated with framed campaigns and mood boards. She talked about optics and messaging. She attended lunches with vendors and took credit for cohesion. When problems surfaced, she forwarded them along often to my inbox, with a brief note saying this needed immediate attention. She rarely followed up. She did not have to. Weeks passed, then months. The temporary arrangement stretched into something permanent without ever being named. No one sat me down to discuss expectations. No one updated my job description. I just kept working. I started arriving early and leaving late. I answered emails at night and reopened my laptop on weekends. When Dad asked why I seemed tired, he said pressure built resilience. He said this was what commitment looked like. He also started commenting on my commute. He said living across town was a waste of time. He said being nearby would show dedication. I found a townhouse a few blocks from the office and moved within a week. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it made sense. My friends noticed the change before I did. They teased me about always being busy. Then they stopped teasing and started asking if I was okay. I canceled my dinner. I missed birthdays. I promised to reschedule and rarely did. Inside the company, something else was happening. People stopped following the usual chain of command and came straight to me. They asked for my opinion before making decisions. They waited for my approval. They brought me problems they did not want to explain to anyone else. I did not have the authority to say no. I also did not have the protection to say yes safely. I just did what needed to be done. Dad liked it that way. I can see that now. He liked having someone who carried the weight without asking for recognition. He liked praising me when it reflected well on him and correcting me when no one else could hear. If I asked about formalizing my role, he said titles were not important. If I mentioned being overwhelmed, he said everyone felt that way sometimes. One afternoon, a major shipment was delayed because of a system error no one could trace. Phones rang non-stop. Emails poured in. I stayed at my desk long after the office emptied, the glow of my screen the only light left on the floor. Hours passed before I found the issue buried deep in outdated processes no one had documented properly. The next morning, Dad called a brief meeting. He thanked the team. He talked about leadership pulling together. Afterward, he stopped by my desk and told me not to make a habit of staying so late. He said it set expectations we could not maintain. That was the moment something inside me shifted quietly but permanently. I began to see the pattern. My work was essential, but invisible. My exhaustion was inconvenient. My presence was valued only as long as it did not disrupt the hierarchy. I asked Human Resources once casually about updating my position. Helen smiled kindly and said those things took time. She said Dad would need to approve it. She said everyone appreciated my contributions. Appreciation did not come with boundaries or security. As the months went on, the system grew more dependent on me. The processes I designed lived in my head and my personal notes. Clients trusted my voice and asked for me by name. No one asked me to train a backup. No one planned for what would happen if I stepped away. I told myself it was loyalty. I told myself it was my responsibility. I told myself it was temporary. One night after shutting down my computer well past dark, I sat alone at my desk and felt the weight of that truth settle in. I had made myself indispensable without ever being protected. I had become the quiet center holding everything together. The realization did not make me angry. It made me deeply tired. I walked out into the cool night air and sat in my car for a long time before driving home. The streets were empty, the city quiet. I wondered how long I could keep doing this. How long I could keep being the daughter who fixed everything without ever being allowed to step into her own life. I did not know it then, but that question was already reshaping me. It was waiting for the moment when I would finally listen to it. That moment did not come from the company. It came from someone who had been watching me disappear piece by piece without saying a word. Her name was Tessa, the only friend who had stayed close even as my world narrowed. We had met years earlier at a small cafe near the university, long before Holt Distribution Services swallowed most of my time. She was warm, direct, and always seemed to see more than she commented on. Back when my life still had space in it, we would meet after work for dinner or walk through the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. She was one of the first people I called when something good happened or when something bad did. But once I stepped into the company full-time, my schedule changed. I started canceling. Once then, twice. Then so often that she stopped suggesting plans, except with a gentle question. about whether I was free, which almost always ended in me apologizing. I usually said Dad needed me. Sometimes it was true. Often it was a convenient way to avoid explaining the exhaustion I could not shake. I told myself she understood. I told myself she did not take it personally. But I never asked. I was too busy running from one responsibility to the next. There was one evening early in 2021 that stayed with me clearly. She had called asking if I wanted to grab dinner. I was in the office, staring at a spreadsheet that kept crashing every time I tried to save it. I had been there since 6 that morning. My head hurts. My shoulders felt like stone. But I answered and told her I could not make it. Dad needed me to fix another issue. She was quiet for a moment, then said she hoped I got some rest. I promised I would. I did not. It became a pattern. She would reach out. I would retreat. Months later, she invited me to her birthday gathering, a small one at a wine bar near downtown Madison. I had intended to go. I even bought her a little gift, a delicate silver bracelet I thought she would like. But that day a client crisis erupted. Rowan had forwarded the issue with a note saying urgent. Dad called me into his office and explained the problem like it was mine to solve alone. I worked late and missed the celebration entirely. On my drive home, I saw the bracelet in the passenger seat and felt a heavy sadness settle in my chest. I texted an apology that I knew sounded too familiar. She replied with a simple message. Maybe next time. Years earlier, she might have asked if something was wrong. She might have pressed for details. But by then, she had learned I was not ready to hear my own truth. It was not until months later, after another missed plan, that she finally said something that stayed with me. She had suggested we meet for brunch on a Sunday morning. I agreed, then had to cancel at the last minute when Dad called about a presentation he wanted revised before Monday. I called Tessa from the office, my voice tight with guilt. She answered softly. I started apologizing. She let me finish, then asked a single question. Are you happy, Maris? The question caught me off guard. I hesitated too long, and she seemed to understand more from my silence than from anything I could have said. She told me she missed me. She told me she was worried. She told me she hoped I would take care of myself. Her voice was warm, not accusing, but it sank into me in a way I could not shake off. After that conversation, I replayed things in my mind. The plans I had canceled, the excuses I had given, the way my world had shrunk until it barely touched anything outside of Holt, distribution services. But I kept going. I told myself things would change once Dad recognized my dedication. I told myself stability required sacrifice. I told myself everyone went through stretches like this. Then came a day in late summer, one of those warm Wisconsin afternoons where the air feels heavy but pleasant. I had taken my lunch break outside to get some fresh air, something I rarely allowed myself. As I sat on the bench near the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tessa. Just checking in. Are you all right? I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I said I was fine, just tired. She asked if we could meet for a walk later that evening. Against my usual instinct, I said yes. We met at Vilas Park near the lake. I remember the way the water caught the sunlight, small ripples moving gently toward the shore. Families were out, kids running, couples walking their dogs. It felt almost foreign to me, that kind of simple calm. We walked slowly at first, catching up on small things. Then she stopped, turning to look at me. She said she wanted to tell me something but did not want me to take it the wrong way. I nodded, bracing myself, though I did not know for what. She told me she had watched me fade over the past year, not dramatically but slowly in pieces. She said she had seen how isolated I had become, how everything in my life seemed to orbit around Dad and the company. She said it looked like I did not have space to breathe, let alone be myself. She told me she had wanted to say something earlier. She had wanted to ask questions, to challenge me, to intervene. But she knew me. She knew I would defend Dad. She knew I would justify the demands placed on me. She knew I would shut down any suggestion that my situation was not normal. She said she stayed quiet, not because she did not care, but because she did. Because she knew pushing me too soon would only make me retreat further. Everyone was waiting for you to be ready. Those were her exact words. Soft, steady, spoken with a kindness that cut through all of my practiced explanations. I felt my breath catch. It was not anger. It was not an embarrassment. It was something quieter and deeper. The realization that her silence had not been abandonment but patience. She had been standing just outside the walls I had built, waiting for the door to crack open. We continued walking after that, not talking much. I let her words settle inside me. They were not a criticism. They were a mirror. One I had avoided looking into for a long time. That evening changed something small but significant inside me. It was the first time I allowed myself to consider that my life might not be as balanced as I insisted it was. The first time I questioned whether the sacrifices I made were truly necessary or simply expected. The first time I wondered what it might feel like to choose myself. I did not act on those thoughts right away. Old habits held on tight. Loyalty, obligation, the desire for approval. They wrapped around me like familiar threads, convincing me I could push a little harder, give a little more, wait a little longer. But Tessa's words stayed with me. They surfaced in quiet moments. They echoed during long nights at the office. They whispered when I canceled plans again. They sat in the back of my mind during conversations with Dad that seemed more like directives than discussions. Everyone was waiting for you to be ready. I realized then that readiness was not something anyone else could hand me. It had to come from the inside, from a small spark that had been dimmed but not extinguished. Looking back, I know that conversation with Tessa was a turning point. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that forces an immediate decision, but the kind that shifts the ground beneath you slowly until one day you notice you are standing somewhere entirely different. When I think about everything that happened after, about the choices I eventually made, about the night at Dad's house when everything snapped into place, I see how much her quiet patience had mattered. She had not abandoned me. She had been waiting for me to see what she had seen all along. What I did not know yet was that the moment of readiness was much closer than I believed. I think that realization is what sent me backward in my own memory, all the way to the years before I ever stepped foot into Holt Distribution, services as anything more than a visitor. Before my life narrowed into responsibility and exhaustion, there had been something else in me, a dream I had shelved so neatly that sometimes I forgot it had ever been mine. Those years between 2014 and 2017 felt like another lifetime now. A softer chapter, one I rarely let myself revisit because of what it stirred in me. Back then, I had worked for a small logistics startup on the east side of Madison. It was nothing grand, nothing prestigious, but it was a place where ideas mattered. My manager encouraged creativity. He let me test solutions on real problems. For the first time, I saw how the moving pieces of an operational system could be shaped, intentionally, not just endured. I was young, eager, and full of energy that seemed endless. The company was scrappy in the best way, full of people figuring things out as they went. We ate lunch together in a cramped break room. We solved problems on whiteboards that were barely erased. We stayed late not because we were forced to, but because we believed we were building something. I remember sitting on my small apartment floor with papers spread around me, sketching out ideas for what I called my one-day business. I did not know exactly what it would become, but I imagined a consulting service focused on operations for small companies, something that would help them avoid chaos by giving them structure at the beginning. I thought about branding. I drafted sample workflows. I researched legal steps. I even picked out a color palette once, though I would never admit it to anyone. For a while, the dream felt real, tangible, within reach. But dreams rarely survive first contact with the people who do not believe in them. One Sunday evening in late 2015, I sat at Dad's kitchen table with my laptop open, excited to show him what I had been working on. I thought he would be proud. I thought he would see ambition, initiative, courage. I had built a small portfolio on the side by helping a few local businesses streamline their processes. They had paid me modestly, sometimes only enough to cover the cost of gas and takeout, but it was mine, something I had earned without carrying the Holt name behind me. Dad listened politely. He rested his elbow on the table, his fingers tapping absently, his eyes skimming the outlines I had prepared. When I finished explaining, he leaned back and said that building a business required more than enthusiasm. He said the market was saturated. He said consulting was unstable work. He said people my age did not have the experience to become experts. He told me to focus on something realistic. He told me I was not that kind of talented. Those words stayed with me like a stain. I smiled and nodded and thanked him for his honesty, but something inside me dimmed. I packed up my laptop and drove home that night with a hollow feeling in my chest, one I could not name at the time. He thought he was protecting me from disappointment, or maybe he simply did not think I could succeed without his guidance. Either way, I let his words take root. For months afterward, I worked in silence. I stopped talking about my ideas. I put my sketches and notes into a drawer and told myself it was only temporary, that I would return to them when I was more experienced. I accepted more responsibilities at my job, poured myself into learning everything I could, convinced that if I could not build something of my own, at least I could become irreplaceable to someone else. But the dream refused to die completely. In the evenings after work, when the apartment was quiet and the world outside felt peaceful, I found myself reading about financial planning or listening to podcasts about investment strategies. I learned how compounding worked. I learned how small, steady steps turned into something meaningful over time. I began setting aside small amounts from each paycheck. Not much, sometimes barely enough to notice, but I kept doing it. I remember opening my first brokerage account with my heart pounding, afraid I would make a mistake I could not reverse. I chose safe investments at first, things that did not swing wildly or demand constant attention. It was slow growth, nearly invisible month to month, but it was growth I controlled. It felt like a tiny rebellion that no one else knew about. In 2016, my company offered a short training program on commercial real estate. It was meant to help employees understand logistics from a property management perspective. Most people attended because it was required. I attended because something inside me lit up. The instructor explained how commercial districts formed, how community needs shape development, how the right property at the right time could transform an entire neighborhood. That idea lodged itself in my mind and stayed there. I began spending weekends walking through parts of Madison I had never visited before. Old industrial blocks, former warehouse districts, small commercial rows tucked into quiet streets. I watched how people moved. I noticed which storefronts stayed full and which ones emptied. I asked business owners what they struggled with. I asked what they loved about their locations. I did not know then what I was searching for. I only knew the searching felt right. Dad did not know about any of this. If he had, he would have told me it was a distraction, that I was wasting my time, that I should focus on the job I already had. So I kept it to myself. It became a private world, one piece of my life untouched by expectation or dismissal. My manager at the startup once told me I had a knack for seeing patterns before others did. At the time, I shrugged it off. But in hindsight, maybe that was the skill that shaped everything that came later. In early 2017, the startup went through restructuring. Budgets tightened, roles shifted, people worried about their jobs. I kept working, kept contributing, kept learning, even as uncertainty hovered over us like a low cloud. It was during that period that Dad approached me with the first hint that would eventually lead me back into his company. He invited me to dinner at his house one evening in the middle of the week, which was unusual. Mom made roast chicken. Rowan showed up wearing a blazer, even though she had nowhere to be. Dad asked about my job. He asked about my plans. He asked if I had considered coming back to Holt Distribution Services in a more official capacity. He said the company needed fresh blood. He said the family legacy mattered. He said I had always been good at solving problems. I felt something inside me tighten, a pull between wanting to share who I had become during those years on my own and wanting to earn the approval I had been chasing since childhood. I did not tell him about my private dreams. I did not tell him about my research or my savings or my growing curiosity about commercial districts. I let him speak. I let him guide the conversation. I let the warmth of his attention wash over me with a dangerous familiarity. When he said that coming back could be a way to prove my commitment, something in me softened. I wanted that. I wanted to be seen. I wanted him to be proud. I told him I would think about it. I did more than think. I let go of my quiet plans once again. I convinced myself that working for the family was the honorable choice, the loyal choice, the grown-up choice. My mom hugged me when I announced my decision. Rowan clapped her hands. Dad smiled in a way that made my heart lift. I let their reactions fill me while I packed away the last pieces of my dream. But not all of it. Even as I settled into Holt Distribution Services months later, Even as I learned the systems and filled the gaps and took on more than my share, a small flame remained tucked deep inside me. It was faint, almost forgotten, but it was still there. During those early years on my own, I had learned how investments worked. I had learned how to read market patterns. I had learned how undervalued properties sometimes hid in places no one bothered to look. And I had saved more than I realized, more than I had ever planned to. By the time I walked into Holt Distribution Services for good, I had built a quiet foundation. A private foundation. I told no one, not even Tessa, especially not Dad. The most surprising part of that time in my life was not that I gave up my dreams so easily. The surprising part was that even buried under layers of obligation, it managed to keep growing roots in the dark. I did not know then that those quiet years of learning and saving and observing would become the most important part of my future. I did not know how much I would need that small flame later. I did not know that the thing I thought I had abandoned would be the thing that saved me. For now, it simply lived inside me, waiting. I did not know then that the thing I thought I had abandoned would be the thing that saved me. That small flame lived inside me quietly, almost shyly, as if afraid of being extinguished by one wrong breath. But it stayed warm and stubborn right under the surface. And in the years that followed, while I worked at Holt Distribution Services and carried responsibilities that never truly belonged to me, that little flame guided me toward one decision that would eventually change everything. It was not dramatic. It was not impulsive. It began with curiosity on a quiet Saturday morning in early 2018, when I drove through a neighborhood called Ironwood Row on the east side of Madison. I had visited the area before during my years at the startup. Back then it had looked tired, like an old stage set after a show had moved to another city. Rusted loading docks, empty storefronts, cracked sidewalks, a block that looked forgotten by time. But neighborhoods in Madison have a strange way of waking up again when no one is paying attention, and Ironwood Row was no exception. I saw a construction tarp covering a building that had been empty since forever. I saw a new coffee shop tucked into a corner. I saw pedestrians again, and I remembered something. Years earlier, Dad had talked endlessly about Ironwood Row. It had been his white whale. He wanted to buy property there long before anyone else saw potential in it. He believed the district would come back stronger than before. He said the location had bones. He said the city would eventually push development eastward. He was right about all of it. But the deal he wanted slipped through his fingers because the negotiations collapsed and the funding at the time had been too tight. He spent months angry about losing the opportunity. He told the story so often that Rowan joked she could recite it by heart. Standing there on that Saturday morning, watching sunlight hit the row of buildings in a way I had never noticed before, the memory returned like a quiet whisper. If this block ever comes back to life, I will regret not being part of it. It had been Dad's voice then, but now the voice sounded different, softer, not hungry, not controlling, not ambitious for the sake of power. The voice now sounded like mine, shaped by my own imagination. I parked my car and walked along the sidewalk, noticing the fine details the way I had been trained to do. Foot traffic, available parking, types of tenants, condition of the buildings, zoning signs. I ran my fingers along a rusted metal surface and felt the potential. Underneath, a for sale sign hung crookedly in the window of a 3-storefront block. The sign was faded, almost embarrassed to still be there. The name of the listing agent looked familiar from my research years ago. I wrote down the number and sat in my car for a long moment, feeling my pulse quicken. It felt reckless to even consider calling. It felt unbelievable. It felt like trying on a life I had convinced myself I could not wear. But the flame inside me pushed through the doubt. I dialed. By the next week, I was standing inside the hollow shell of the building with a flashlight and a notebook. The listing agent explained that the owner had been trying to sell for years, but kept backing out, waiting for a redevelopment project that never came. The building needed repairs. The roof needed partial replacement. But the foundation was solid. The structure was good. The block had started attracting interest again. When he told me the price, my heart pounded so hard I thought he could hear it. It was not cheap, not by any stretch, but it was within reach. Not because I was wealthy, I was not, but because I had been saving quietly for years. Every bit of freelance consulting money, every annual bonus, every cautious investment. All of it had added up to something more than I realized. I went home that night with my head spinning. I did the math 3 times. Then I did it again with a calculator because I did not trust my own excitement. When the numbers still made sense, I closed the blinds in my apartment, sat on the floor and whispered to myself that maybe, just maybe, this was possible. The next morning I created an LLC. I called it Ironwood Holdings. Simple, unremarkable. A name that would not draw attention and would not raise questions. I filed the paperwork, paid the fees, and felt something inside me shift in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The LLC was legally mine. Completely mine. I did not tell anyone. Not Tessa, not Mom, certainly not Dad, especially not Dad. 2 weeks later, after inspections and negotiations and endless signatures, Ironwood Holdings became the legal owner of the 3 storefront blocks. The moment the sale was finalized, I closed the laptop, pressed my hands over my face, and sat in silence as a wave of emotion washed over me. I had done something on my own. Something big. Something Dad always claimed was beyond my abilities, and no one knew. I spent the next year managing the property quietly, almost invisibly. I learned how to vet tenants. I learned how to negotiate leases. I met with contractors and city inspectors. I worked nights and weekends making decisions that scared me but thrilled me. 2. My tenants were small business owners, a pottery studio, a bakery, a tiny bookstore that smelled like old paper and hope. None of them knew who I really was. They only knew Ironwood Holdings as a friendly but firm landlord, and I liked it that way. I kept the building modest at first. Modest rent, modest improvements, but the district around us grew fast. The city invested in new sidewalks and lighting. A bike path opened 2 blocks away. Cafes and boutiques moved in. People walked their dogs past my building every evening. They pushed strollers. They carried iced coffee. They laughed. They breathed life into a block that had been asleep for decades. By 2020, the building was full. Every storefront had a tenant. People started asking if I would consider selling. Developers sent agents to make offers. But I had no intention of selling. The block had become something I never had in my life before. A space untouched by Dad's expectations. A space where my ideas mattered. A space where I could breathe. My breathing space. Occasionally, Dad still mentioned Ironwood Row in passing, usually with regret. He talked about how he wished he had pushed harder back then, how he could have turned that whole district into something remarkable. Each time he spoke about it, I felt my heartbeat quicken. I would picture the documents hidden in my safe. The mortgage statements, the rent deposits, the Ironwood Holdings letterhead. Sometimes he said the district would have been perfect for Holt distribution. Services if he had secured the property before the market changed. Rowan usually nodded with that familiar admiration she reserved only for him. I said nothing. Not because I wanted to hide forever, but because revealing the truth would have been like unfolding a delicate flower in the middle of a thunderstorm. It was too fragile then. Too new. I was not ready to let him touch something I had built without him. Something he did not get to shape or judge or control. During those years, I visited Ironwood Row often to walk the block and take notes. I watched my tenants prepare for events. I saw couples stroll from one end to the other during summer nights. Families gathered during holiday weekends. There was a small square near the corner that lit up with Christmas. Decorations every December. Children posed for photos beside strings of lights that wrapped around. Lampposts. I sometimes stood across the street and watched without anyone noticing me. It felt like belonging and independence wrapped into one place. Dad still believed Ironwood Row was a missed opportunity, a failure he could not correct, a street he wished he had captured before anyone else saw it. He never imagined it belonged to me, not once. And so when he told me at Christmas dinner that maybe I should go live in the streets if I could not handle the demands of the family, he spoke so casually, so confidently that it almost stunned me with how perfectly ironic it was. The streets, the ones he used as an insult, the ones he believed symbolized failure. He had no idea that the only street he ever truly wanted was the one I already owned, the one I had restored, the one that now thrived under my quiet care. Ironwood Row had become a commercial gem by 2022. Not the most glamorous district in Madison, but authentic busy. full of character and community. The type of block developers admired from afar because they knew its value would only increase. Dad did not know that the Christmas lights he admired every winter on his way to the mall were hanging on buildings I had renovated. He did not know the bakery Mom loved was leasing from me. He did not know the pottery studio Rowan bragged about visiting with her friends and paid rent directly to Ironwood Holdings each month. And he did not know that the insult he threw at me across that Christmas table was the exact trigger that made the small flame inside me burst into something brighter. When I stood from the table that night and said I would invite them to my street party, none of them understood what I meant. Rowan thought I was being dramatic. Dad assumed I was being disrespectful. Mom looked worried, as if afraid I might be spiraling. But I walked out of that house knowing something with absolute clarity. The street he had meant as punishment was the one place where I had built a life entirely of my own choosing. A life they had never touched. And for the first time in many years, I realized that maybe the street was where I finally became myself. I drove home slowly that night, letting the silence inside my car settle around me. Madison's winter lights blurred through the windshield. Ironwood Row was only 15 minutes from my apartment. I considered driving there then just to see it, just to remind myself that it was real. I did not go. Instead, I sat in my apartment for a long time, remembering the first day I walked that block, remembering the feeling of seeing something before anyone else believed in it, remembering all the nights I spent learning about leases and maintenance and zoning laws, remembering the pride that swelled inside me each time a tenant thanked me for supporting their business. Dad had never thanked me for anything I built at Holt Distribution Services, but Ironwood Row had thanked me in its own quiet ways. The way families lingered near storefronts, the way tenants decorated their windows, the way people came back again and again because the block felt warm and alive. That was mine. And now that Dad had thrown his final insult like a casual flick of the wrist, that small flame in my chest refused to flicker anymore. It grew. It burned. It lit my thoughts with a new kind of determination. The streets. He told me to live in them. He had no idea that I already did. I already did. I already lived in them. That thought stayed with me long after the winter quiet settled over my apartment. It pulsed gently in my chest, steady and certain, like a truth that had always been there but never spoken aloud. The next morning I woke up before the sun, unable to fall back asleep. I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the early frost gather on the glass. I knew I was supposed to feel ashamed after what had happened at dinner. Humiliated. Cast out. That was the reaction Dad expected. But instead, my mind kept circling one thought clear as the cold air outside. If he wanted me to go live in the streets, then I would show him exactly which streets were mine. Ironwood Row hosted a small winter festival every December, usually on the weekend before Christmas. It had started as a neighborhood event organized by the business owners, but over the years it had grown into a minor local attraction. People wandered through to shop, drink mulled cider, listen to carolers, and enjoy the decorations. My tenants worked hard to make it special, and I always supported them quietly from the background. But this year will be different. This year, Ironwood Row was fully leased, financially strong, and more vibrant than ever. My bakery tenant, Sunhill Oven, had installed new outdoor heaters for patio seating. The pottery studio had expanded its winter showcase. The bookstore was hosting a children's reading hour. Even the small wine bar at the corner was planning live music. And I, for the first time, was going to step out from the background and stand in my own creation. Not as Maris Holt, the daughter who kept a company running. Not as the girl who Dad dismissed. Not as the sister Rowan loved to outshine. But as the owner of Ironwood Row. I started planning my street party with a calmness that surprised me. It did not need to be dramatic. It did not need speeches or explanations. It simply needed to exist. A celebration for the people who had built this block alongside me, and a chance for my family to see the truth, without me pushing it into their hands. I emailed each tenant individually and told them that Ironwood Holdings would sponsor additional lighting, music, and refreshments for this year's event. They were thrilled. One of them replied that no landlord she had ever worked with cared enough to do something like that. I smiled at the message longer than I should have. By the time noon rolled around, I had drafted the invitations. They were brief and almost plain. Christmas on Ironwood Row. Winter Street Celebration. Saturday at 6 in the evening. All are welcome. At the bottom, I added a short line. Hosted by Ironwood Holdings. I did not sign my name. I did not attach any explanation. I let the words speak for themselves. After printing a few copies, I sat at my dining table, staring at two envelopes, one addressed to Dad, one to Rowan. I had debated sending them at all. Part of me thought it would be easier to stay small, to stay silent, to watch from a distance as the block filled with people. I had learned silence well, but silence was the very thing that had let everyone believe I was small. Dad had spoken loudly for years, Rowan too. Maybe it was time for me to speak softly but clearly. I drove to Dad's house in the late afternoon. He was outside shoveling the walkway, brisk movements cutting through the cold air. When he saw me pull up, his face tightened. He did not come closer. I walked up the driveway and handed him an envelope. He looked down at it as if it were a piece of junk mail. What is this, an invitation? To what? A winter event? A street party? He made a low, dismissive sound. That is what you are doing with your time now. Throwing parties. I held his gaze without a single tremor. Yes, Dad. He frowned as if searching for something sharp to say, but for once he had no ammunition. Rowan opened the door as I headed back toward my car. She wore a thick scarf, and the expression she saved for moments she believed. She had the upper hand. So this is real. You are actually hosting some kind of street thing. Some kind, I said lightly. Good for you, she replied. But her tone made the words feel like a pat on the head. I doubt we will be able to come. Dad has real obligations. I simply nodded. Whether they came or not did not matter. The intention did. The door closed behind her. I got into my car and allowed myself one long breath before driving away. The next few days passed in a blur of coordination. Music permits, lighting contracts, space markers for vendor tables, insurance updates. It felt like slipping back into the version of myself I had been before Holt. Distribution services took over my life. Creative, capable, focused on building something meaningful. I visited Ironwood Row each evening after work, walking the sidewalks and checking on the decorations. The air smelled like pine and bread and cold winter air. The lights shimmered across wet pavement. Parents tugged children bundled in coats and mittens. Couples held hands. People laughed. This was my world, my quiet success, my oxygen. On Friday evening, the wine bar owner Francis waved me over. He was hanging garlands around the window frame. Big turnout tomorrow, he said. People are excited. I hear the owner of Ironwood Holdings is finally making an appearance. I smiled faintly. That is the rumor. He stepped down from the ladder and looked at me with an expression that made my chest warm. I know you like to keep things private, but I want to thank you. This block would not be what it is without your investment, without your patience. Most owners just want quick profit. You wanted community. I swallowed softly. His gratitude touched a part of me that had been starved for years. Thank you, Francis. He nodded once as if he understood more than I had said, then went back to arranging decorations. On Saturday morning, I woke up early again. Not from anxiety, from anticipation. Ironwood Row would begin setting up booths by 10. The musicians arrived at noon for sound checks. The bakery started baking early. The entire street felt alive, even in the pale winter light. I dressed simply. A dark coat, a warm scarf, comfortable boots. I did not want to stand out, not at first. I wanted the block to shine before I did. At 5:30, I parked my car several blocks away. The sky was already dark, and the lights along Ironwood Row glowed like a string of fireflies. People moved through the street, laughing, shopping, and listening to music. A soft dusting of snow fell, making everything feel almost enchanted. I lingered at the edge for a moment, letting it sink in. This was mine. This life. This block. This night. At 5:40, my phone buzzed. A message from Tessa. Already here. It looks amazing. Where are you? I typed back. A little away. I will come at the right time. At 5:50, I spotted Mom. She stood beside one of the heaters, arms crossed for warmth, looking around with an expression somewhere between curiosity and worry. Rowan was next to her, scrolling on her phone. Dad was there too. He looked stiff, uncomfortable, as if he had been dragged somewhere beneath his dignity. They had come. I felt nothing sharp at the sight of them. only a quiet steadiness that surprised me. I watched for a few minutes longer as they examined the storefronts, unaware of their connection to me. Rowan nudged Dad and pointed at the bakery. "This place is nice." "I did not know this street had changed so much," Dad grunted. "Should have bought property here years ago. It would have been a gold mine by now." I folded my hands in my coat pockets. If only he knew. At 6 exactly, the music shifted to a brighter melody. The crowd clapped. A little girl tugged her mother toward the Christmas display. People toasted with warm drinks. The block seemed to glow. It was time. I stepped forward, weaving gently through the crowd until I reached the small open square where the owners traditionally gathered at the start of the event. Several tenants spotted me and waved warmly. A few whispered to each other, realizing this was my first time standing with them publicly. As I moved closer, I felt eyes following me. Not everyone yet, but enough. Then Rowan's voice carried faintly through the air. "Is that Maris? What is she doing up there?" I paused at the edge of the chasse, square letting the moment hold still for one long breath. The lights shimmered on the snow. The music quieted. People smiled in my direction. I had planned no speech. I did not need one. I simply stepped into the light and let the truth rise naturally, like something that had been waiting for its moment. Ironwood Row would speak for me, and my family would hear it whether they understood it or not. I stepped into the light and let the truth rise naturally, like something that had been waiting for its moment. For a second, everything felt suspended. The music softened, the crowd shifted, and the winter air wrapped around me in a quiet, steady way that made my pulse slow instead of race. I had expected anxiety. I had expected nerves. Instead, I felt grounded, as if Ironwood Row itself rooted me in place. Then the moment broke gently as Darren from the Madison Business Association spotted me near the front and waved. "Maris, you made it." He said it warmly, loudly enough that people nearby turned toward us. Darren was tall and enthusiastic, with a voice that always carried just a bit farther than he intended. He stepped forward and clapped a hand on my shoulder, as if we had known each other for years. In some ways we had. He had been instrumental in helping Ironwood Row qualify for various small business grants over the past 2 years. He had also been one of the few people who knew exactly who Ironwood Holdings belonged to. I smiled. I wouldn't miss it. Behind him, I saw Dad and Rowan weaving through the crowd, both looking around with an expression somewhere between confusion and irritation. Mom followed closely behind them, her eyes scanning the lights with admiration, not yet aware of what was unfolding. Darren turned toward a small group of people near the heaters. "Looks like we have most of the block's partners here." "Good. Let's gather everyone for the kickoff." I stayed where I was, neither stepping forward nor backing away. Tenants drifted closer and formed a semicircle, chatting and greeting one another. Francis from the wine bar lifted his cup of mulled wine toward me. The bakery owner waved with both hands. Even the bookstore owner, who rarely left her shop, stood near the center of the group. Dad finally reached the edge of the gathering. He frowned at the number of people at the Christmas lights, at the music that clearly cost more than a neighborhood budget. He leaned toward Rowan. "This looks bigger than I thought." "Who is financing this?" Rowan shrugged. "Probably a donor or some small business thing. Why would Maris be up there?" I heard every word. And for the first time, it did not sting. Their assumptions felt distant, like voices underwater. Darren lifted his hands slightly to get the group's attention. "All right, everyone, thank you for coming. We are thrilled to celebrate the continued growth of Ironwood Row. This block has become one of our most successful independent commercial districts in Madison, and tonight represents a milestone in that journey." A light ripple of applause followed. Dad looked around again, now more curious than annoyed. He whispered to Mom, "This district has done well. I did not expect it to recover this quickly." Mom nodded absently, taking in the storefronts with quiet nostalgia. "I always liked it here, even years ago." It felt like it was waiting for something. Her words made something warm bloom in my chest. Darren continued, "Tonight is special, not just because of the holiday season, but because this is the first time our block's owner has chosen to stand with us publicly." Dad straightened sharply. "Owner?" Rowan frowned. "I thought these buildings were owned by different people." Darren smiled broadly. "Actually, all 3 storefronts on this block are held by one company, and I'm honored to say that Ironwood Holdings is represented tonight at the person responsible for bringing this community back to life. He gestured toward me with an open hand. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the owner of Ironwood Row, Maris Holt. A hush fell so quickly it felt like the air changed temperature. My name moved across the crowd like a soft, incredulous ripple. Dad froze where he stood, his posture locked. His mouth parted as if a question had been cut off mid-breath. Rowan blinked rapidly, her expression turning strangely pale. Mom brought a hand to her chest, stunned but not fearful, almost like she was seeing me for the first time. People turned toward me with warm, encouraging smiles. Not applause, not noise, just genuine acknowledgement. I stepped forward at one small pace, enough to accept the moment without claiming more space than necessary. Thank you. It has been an honor to watch this block grow. That was all I said. No speech, no explanation, no claim of victory, just a truth spoken simply. But the simplicity of it hit harder than any declaration could have. The crowd responded with quiet applause. A few tenants reached for my hands. Some nodded with pride. Darren grinned as if he had been waiting for this reveal for months. I felt the shift in the atmosphere like gravity tilting, and I knew when it happened. Dad's eyes found mine. Not angry, not proud. Something more complicated, something restless and sharp. A recognition that the ground had changed beneath him, and he had not felt the first tremor until it was too late. His expression flickered from confusion to disbelief, to something like fear, the kind of fear that arrives when a man realizes he misjudged the one person he thought he understood completely. Rowan touched his arm. Dad, is that true? She sounded small. Darren moved on with his remarks explaining renovation credits, highlighting community growth, thanking business owners. His voice filled the space around us, but Dad did not hear a single word. His gaze stayed locked on me, or maybe on everything he had failed to see in the last few years. I stepped back into the group, letting the moment dissolve naturally. I did not look at him again. I let the crowd absorb me, let the lights and music carry the energy forward. Inside, though, I felt a shift of my own. A release, a loosening of something tightly wound for too long. Soon people drifted into smaller groups. Francis offered samples of holiday spritzers. The bakery passed out cinnamon bites. Children ran in circles around the Christmas display. The night warmed with voices and laughter. Dad did not move. Mom approached him gently. Her voice was low, but I saw her reach for his arm. Thomas. She rarely used his first name in public. You should sit for a moment. Rowan stared between him and Ironwood Row with an expression that pulsed, between envy and confusion. Finally she muttered, she really kept this secret. Dad swallowed hard. His jaw worked, the muscle twitching. Why would she do something like this? Mom gave him a look that was weary and knowing. Maybe because she needed something of her own. I pretended not to hear, but the words settled deep inside me. Darren joined me near the storefront of the pottery studio. I figured it was time, he said with a playful grin. They needed to know eventually. I nodded. Yes, they did. You handled it well, he added. Most people would have given a speech, or made it a whole thing. I smiled lightly. I think the less I say, the clearer it becomes. He laughed. True enough. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. As he walked away to greet another group, I let myself breathe in the moment fully. The streetlights glowed softly against the falling snow. The air smelled like sugar and pine. People walked in and out of shops I had repaired myself. They stood on sidewalks resurfaced with grants I applied for. They toasted with drinks under heaters I had installed. None of them knew the girl who once folded her dreams into the smallest corners of her life. They only knew the woman who had built something steady and real. Dad finally moved through the crowd toward me. The path cleared without anyone intending it. He stopped a few feet away, his breath fogging in the cold air. His voice was unsteady. You never told me. I kept my hands in my coat pockets. You never asked. His eyebrows pulled together. That is not fair, Maris. I tilted my head. Isn't it? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in my life, I was not the one trying to fill the silence. I let him sit in it. Rowan appeared at his side, eyes still wide with disbelief. So what, you own all this? All of it? Just this block, I answered. A simple truth offered without pride or apology. Her lips parted, but she had no words ready. It was as if the language she used to define me had been ripped away. Mom stepped closer, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. She searched my face for something, though I could not tell what. Maybe guilt, maybe joy, maybe reassurance. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled in a way that felt fragile and beautiful. "Morris, why did you hide this from us?" "Because," I said softly, "I needed one part of my life that was mine." Dad's breath caught. For a moment his shoulders sagged just slightly. I expected him to argue. I expected him to claim he would have supported me. I expected him to say I should have told him so he could advise me. But the truth was written clearly across his face. He knew none of those claims would be true. He had not believed in me. He had not encouraged me. He had not imagined I was capable of anything beyond serving his needs. Ironwood Row proved otherwise. He looked at the ground. Snow gathering in the lines of his coat sleeves. The quiet around him felt like a man standing inside the ruins of a belief he had built brick by brick. A belief that his youngest daughter was dependable, obedient, small. Nothing about Ironwood Row was small. As people moved past us toward the music and lights, his eyes drifted over the storefronts again, over the bakery where Mom liked to buy lemon tarts, over the wine bar Rowan had bragged about, over the pottery studio where he once bought a vase without knowing he was contributing to my work. He swallowed once visibly. "All these years," he murmured. "All these years owning something you wanted, I finished for him." Yes. He stared at me as if seeing a stranger, or maybe seeing me for the very first time. I felt no triumph, no gloating, just a profound and quiet release, like air finally escaping a sealed room. A few minutes later, the band began a new song and people clapped along. The lights brightened. Children shouted in excitement, and the block pulsed with joy. I stepped away from my family and moved back into the heart of the celebration. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not because I had won anything, but because I had nothing left to prove. Behind me, Dad remained standing in the snow, a man suspended in realization, his power unspooling quietly simply because I no longer lived beneath it. And with that, the night carried forward, leaving the old dynamics behind like distant echoes swallowed by the music. People drifted deeper into the celebration, drawn toward the music and warm lights. But I stayed at the edge of the square for a moment longer, letting the tension inside me unravel thread by thread. Dad's silhouette remained frozen in the snow behind me, but I did not look back again. The street had already spoken. The truth had already settled into the winter air, quiet but solid. By the time I reached my apartment later that night, my body felt both exhausted and strangely weightless. I slept like someone who had finally stopped bracing for impact. In the days that followed, Madison returned to its usual cold rhythm. The street party was mentioned online by a few local blogs. People posted pictures of the decorations. Tenants emailed again to thank me for the support. Everything felt gentle and ordinary, which only highlighted how extraordinary the shift inside me had been. When Monday arrived, I woke before my alarm. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I dressed in simple black slacks, a soft sweater, and boots warm enough for the icy walk from the parking lot to the main entrance of Holt Distribution Services. The sky was still gray when I pulled into my usual spot. I sat there with the engine running for a moment, watching my breath cloud the air. Then I turned off the car and stepped out. The building looked the same as it always had. Wide glass windows, the large Holt logo salt scattered across the sidewalk. But it felt different because I was different. For the first time, I was not walking in as the person trying to keep everything standing. I was walking in as someone who had already built something of her own. Inside, the early morning hum filled the lobby. Phones rang, printers buzzed. People carried coffee cups and clipboards. I passed familiar faces and several greeted me, unaware of the shift already forming beneath their feet. When I reached my desk, I set down my bag and pulled out a single envelope addressed to HR. Inside was my resignation letter. No flourish, no dramatic explanation, just simple clarity. I sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle. This was the desk where I had taken phone calls at 6 a.m. This was the chair where I had eaten meals between spreadsheets. This was where I had solved crises no one else wanted to deal with. And yet it felt oddly easy to pick up the envelope and walk toward HR. Helen, the HR director, was seated at her desk reviewing documents. When she saw me, her eyebrows lifted with mild surprise. "Good morning, Maris. Is everything all right?" I handed her the envelope. She opened it quickly, scanned the page, then looked up with a stunned expression. "You are resigning. Immediately." "Yes, but this is so sudden. We have not discussed it. She blinked several times. "May I ask why?" I kept my voice calm. "I think it is time for a change." She stared at me as if waiting for a fuller explanation, but I gave her none. After a long moment, she nodded, professional expression forced into place. "I will need to schedule an exit meeting and notify leadership. Thank you." As I stepped out of her office, I nearly collided with Grant, the operations manager. He looked frazzled, hair slightly out of place, jacket half zipped. "Maris, thank God you are here. We have a routing problem with the Wilson account. The drivers are confused. The software keeps spitting out errors, and I do not know why. I tried to call you earlier, but your phone must have been off." I met his panicked eyes without absorbing a single drop of anxiety. "I am on my way to finish my resignation paperwork. I will not be handling the Wilson account anymore." He froze. "Resignation. What are you talking about?" I handed him the copy of my letter. He scanned it, mouth falling open. "You cannot leave. Look, of course you can leave, but you cannot leave. Not right now. I do not know how to run half of what you manage." "You will figure it out," I said gently, "or Dad will need to restructure." He sputtered, struggling for words. "But your role is essential. You handle everything from routing to crisis management to client escalations. If you go, we will." I let him finish the sentence in his mind. He exhaled sharply. "Did Dad know about this?" "No." He pressed his hand to the back of his neck. "He is not going to take this well." I did not answer. Grant hurried off toward the executive wing, resignation letter in hand, leaving me standing in the corridor with a strange sense of peace. I returned to my desk, gathered my personal items into a small box, and listened to the office noise around me. It sounded distant, like echoes of a life I no longer belonged to. About 20 minutes later, my desk phone rang. I almost ignored it, but old habits made me pick up. "This is Maris." A familiar voice crackled through the line. "Mark from the Wilson account. Oh, thank God. We have been trying to reach you all morning. Nobody here knows what they are doing without you." I closed my eyes. Mark was kind, but his panic only confirmed something I had known for a long time. The entire system had been built on me without recognition, and they had let it happen because it benefited them. I no longer owed them the stability they refused to give me. "I am not with the company anymore, Mark. I resigned this morning. Someone else will assist you moving forward." There was a long pause. "Well, that explains the chaos." He sighed. "I am sorry to hear that. I hope wherever you go next treats you better." "Thank you," I said softly. After ending the call, I tucked the phone back into its cradle and felt the final thread loosen inside my chest. By noon, HR contacted me again for a brief exit meeting. The questions were routine. Did I have feedback? Did I have concerns? Would I consider returning in the future? I answered politely, but gave them nothing substantial. Not because I was trying to be evasive, but because I was done explaining myself to people who only listened when the consequences touched them. When the meeting ended, Helen stood to shake my hand. She looked conflicted, as if torn between protocol and genuine worry. "I wish you the best, Maris. Truly, thank you." As I walked down the hallway toward the main entrance, I passed Grant again. He looked paler than before, clutching folders and mumbling into his phone. "We cannot replace her in a week. I don't care what you think, we just cannot." His stress no longer weighed on me. I stepped into the lobby. The glass doors reflected my face back at me. Not tired, not anxious, just steady. Outside the wind was sharp, but the sky was bright. People hurried along the sidewalk, wrapped in scarves and heavy coats. I walked slowly through the parking lot, carrying only a small box of belongings. When I reached my car, I placed the box on the passenger seat and stood there for a moment, letting the cold air fill my lungs. This was the parking lot where I had spent countless nights leaving after everyone else. This was the path I had walked in darkness, when overtime stretched into late fatigues hours. This was the building whose lights I had turned off more times than I could remember. And now I was leaving it behind. Not as a failure, not as a daughter who could not handle the pressure, but as a woman who finally understood her own worth. I opened the car door, sat down, and rested my hands on the steering wheel. The silence felt like a soft blanket, warm and protective. For a long time, I had believed my value existed only inside Holt Distribution Services, that without the company I would lose all purpose. But that belief had never been mine. It had been shaped by years of expectations and guilt and obligation. Ironwood Row had shown me the truth. My value was never tied to Dad's approval. My future was never meant to be confined to a desk beneath fluorescent lights. My life could expand in ways I had never allowed myself to imagine. I started the car. The engine hummed gently. When I drove away from the building, I did not look in the rearview mirror. There was no reason to. The part of my life that belonged to Holt Distribution Services was already finished, and what waited ahead was a future shaped by my own hands. I did not know as I drove away from the building that morning how quickly everything inside those walls would begin to unravel. I only knew that the weight on my chest had lifted in a way I had never felt before. For the first time in years, I drove home without replaying emails in my head, without planning solutions, without bracing for the next crisis. The silence inside my car was not empty, it was peaceful. 2 days passed quietly. I slept. I cleaned my apartment. I walked through Ironwood Row at dusk and watched families take pictures under the holiday lights. Tenants stopped to chat with me, asking about the next season, offering ideas for spring events. It felt like stepping fully into a life that had always waited patiently for me. Then early Thursday morning, my phone started buzzing. I ignored the first call because I did not recognize the number. When the same number called again 5 minutes later, then again a third time, I turned the phone over and watched it vibrate across the counter. I was making breakfast, listening to a soft radio station, letting my thoughts wander lazily. I let the phone ring until it stopped, but then another call came through, this time from Grant. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message so frantic I had to sit down to listen. His voice shook. He spoke too fast. "Maris, call me. Please. The Barton contract is imploding. They said they emailed you about the routing system last week, and no one here knows what to do. The software crashed. The shipments have stalled in 2 cities, and they are threatening to pull the contract. I need your notes. I need your files. I just need you to call me back." I sat at my kitchen table and watched the snow fall through my window. The smell of toast drifted through the air. The voicemail replayed in the background, his words tumbling over each other. A part of me felt a small tug of sympathy, not for the company itself, but for the panic in his voice. He had relied on me. They all had. But reliance was not respect. I deleted the message. By noon, the calls were constant. The main line, HR, the warehouse manager, the client services director. Most went to voicemail. I did not listen to any of them. I had nothing left to give. Then Rowan called. My phone lit up with her name, and for a moment I just stared at it. I could picture her face already, annoyed, superior, angry that something no longer bent beneath her weight. I answered. Her voice exploded through the speaker. "What did you do?" I kept my tone even. I resigned. "You knew that. You cannot just walk out like that. Everything is falling apart. Do you even understand what is happening here?" I looked out at the quiet little street below my apartment. A man walked his dog bundled in a thick coat. The world looked steady and calm. "Rowan," I said, "I worked there for years. I carried responsibilities no one else wanted to touch. I warned Dad I was exhausted. I told him I needed support. He told me to go live in the streets, so I left. It was that simple." She let out a sharp breath. "We need your system documentation. We cannot find half of your files. Do you realize how much of the workflow depends on processes only you understand?" "Yes," I said softly. "I do." She was silent for a moment, and for the first time there was no arrogance in her voice, just fear. "Maris, the Barton contract was our largest account this quarter. If they pull out, it is going to crush us. Dad is furious. Grant is falling apart. You have to come in just for 1 day. Help us stabilize things." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. "Rowan, I am not coming back." Her breath caught. She had not expected that answer, not in that tone. "It is not about what you want anymore. The company needs you." "No, The company needs to operate without depending on one exhausted person. They built a system on top of me and called it normal. Now they can build something else. She made a frustrated noise. You are being selfish. For a brief second, I felt something flare in my chest. A quiet strength that had been growing since the moment I walked out of Dad's house. Selfish, I said. For the first time in my life, maybe I am. And maybe that is exactly what I needed to survive. I ended the call before she could answer. By Friday morning, the first real consequence hit. Barton officially withdrew from their quarterly contract. It was the kind of loss that created public waves. And by noon, it had already been mentioned in an online logistics newsletter. I had spent years preventing situations exactly like this. Now, watching it unfold from the outside, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Not satisfied, not revenge, just acceptance. The collapse was inevitable. I had not caused it. I had simply stopped holding it up. Later that afternoon, Tessa came over with coffee. She sat cross-legged on my couch while I gave her the short version of everything that had happened that week. She listened without interrupting, then shook her head slowly. So they finally felt what it is like without you. Took them long enough. I shrugged. They built everything on the assumption that I would never leave. She sipped her drink. And you finally let yourself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow drifted softly outside. The heat clicked on and filled the apartment with a gentle hum. Do you feel bad? She asked. I considered the question. I thought about the chaos, the missed deadlines, the collapse of a contract I had saved 4 times in the past year alone. I thought of the stress that had lived inside my body for so long it had felt like part of my spine. Then I shook my head. No, I really don't. That night, as I sat watching the lights of Ironwood Row glow in the distance, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Mom. She rarely called me without a reason. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was soft. Maris, I know things are tense, but your dad has been trying to reach you. He said it is urgent. I swallowed gently. Did he say why he is overwhelmed? He keeps saying the company is falling apart. I leaned back on the sofa. Mom, I cannot fix it for him. Not anymore. I heard her quiet inhale. I understand. I want you to know that I am proud of you. I always have been, even when I did not know everything. A lump rose unexpectedly in my throat. Thank you, Mom. After we hung up, I stared out at the winter night. The lights along Ironwood Row shimmered like steady, tiny stars. Cars crawled along the street. People walked with shopping bags and warm coats. Life felt balanced again. Saturday morning came with another voicemail from Dad. His voice sounded strained, pulled tight like something fraying at the edges. Maris, I need you to call me. This is serious. Holt Distribution Services cannot function like this. You cannot simply walk away. You owe this family more than silence. I let the message finish. Then I deleted it. I did not owe silence anymore, and I certainly did not owe sacrifice. Throughout the next few days, more consequences shook the company. One of the warehouse supervisors quit abruptly, frustrated by the lack of leadership. 2 smaller clients followed Barton and paused their contracts until further notice. Delivery schedules slipped. Customer complaints piled up. Even their new software provider contacted them directly. Confused by the sudden mismanagement, I learned all of this. Not because I went looking for information, but because people called me out of habit. Unaware I no longer belonged to that world. At first I felt a faint tug of guilt. Then I realized it was not guilt at all. It was the ghost of responsibility. A reflex. A muscle memory from years of holding everything together. But when I breathed through it, the feeling faded. I was not hurting them. I was simply absent. The collapse belonged to them, not me. They built a fragile structure and blamed me when it crumbled. On Tuesday afternoon, as I walked through Ironwood Row, checking window displays, Francis stepped outside with a broom. He smiled at me warmly. You look lighter these days. I laughed softly. I feel lighter. He nodded knowingly. Sometimes letting go is the closest thing to justice we ever get. His words settled deep in my chest. Justice. Karma. Balance. I had not taken anything from Dad or Rowan. I had not sabotaged the company. I had not used Ironwood Row to embarrass them. All I had done was stop carrying weight that was never mine to begin with. and that was enough for the truth to reveal itself. I paused near the bookstore window and watched a mother and child walking, hand in hand through the cold air. Their laughter drifted toward me like something delicate and hopeful. Maybe this was what karma really looked like. Not a lightning strike, not a dramatic collapse, but the simple act of removing yourself from the role everyone forced you into. The world adjusted, revealing what had been broken all along. As I continued down the sidewalk, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots, I felt no anger toward Dad, no desire for revenge, only a steady, growing certainty that walking away had been the moment I reclaimed my life. And the consequences that followed were never mine to carry. I did not realize how deeply the quiet would settle into my life until months had passed, and the winter that once felt sharp and heavy gave way to a softer spring. The snow melted from the sidewalks of Ironwood Row, revealing the stone patterns we had installed the previous summer. The storefronts changed their displays to pastel colors and handwritten signs for seasonal specials. People filled the street again, laughing and wandering, drifting in and out of the bakery and the wine bar and the pottery studio. Life kept moving, and this time I moved with it instead of against it. A year slipped by almost gently. Ironwood Row grew stronger, steadier, more rooted in the community than ever. We added benches near the small square where the winter lights used to hang. The florist expanded into the empty space next to her shop. The wine bar started hosting weekend jazz nights. The bookstore now offered writing workshops once a month. There was a rhythm to it all, a heartbeat that matched something inside me. I kept my work steady but not overwhelming. I learned how to delegate, how to trust others, how to say no without guilt. I walked the block every few days, checking on small repairs, greeting tenants, listening to ideas. I was not a shadow owner anymore, but I was also not a spotlight seeker. I simply belonged, and that was enough. My relationship with my family changed too, though not dramatically. Dad and I spoke occasionally, usually through short calls initiated by him. There was no apology in his words, no direct acknowledgement of what had happened. But the sharpness in his tone was gone. He sounded older sometimes, tired, a man who had been forced to face the truth of his own limitations. Rowan maintained a distance that was polite but strained. She no longer treated me as if I were beneath her, but she also did not know how to treat me any other way. Our conversations were careful, cautious, held up by neutral topics and thin smiles. Mom visited Ironwood Row once during the summer and walked beside me quietly, as I explained each storefront. She listened with a softness I had not seen in her for years, and at one point she touched my arm and whispered that she hoped I knew how. Proud she was. I believed her. Things were not perfect. They were simply real, and real was enough for me. The company continued to operate, though not at the pace it once had. They restructured. They hired 3 people to handle the responsibilities that used to rest on my desk alone. I heard from a former coworker that Dad had stepped back from some of his duties, letting outside consultants take over operational decisions. The Barton contract never returned. Other clients stayed, but with conditions. I felt no satisfaction in their struggle, only a quiet understanding. Systems collapse when weight is placed on one point for too long. It was never sustainable. What surprised me most during that year was how much space opened inside my life. Space I did not know had been missing. I started waking up without a knot in my stomach. I took morning walks through my neighborhood. I spent evenings reading or meeting Tessa for dinner. I found myself breathing more deeply, listening more fully, feeling more present than I had in years. Ironwood Row hosted its second winter street festival that December. This time I stood in the crowd from the beginning, not waiting at the edge. People waved at me, greeted me warmly, and asked my opinion on new ideas for the coming year. The lights glowed brighter than the year before, or maybe I simply saw them more clearly. At one point in the evening, as music played and snow drifted lightly through the air, I stepped away from the crowd to watch everything from a small distance. The bakery doors opened and closed with steady streams of visitors. The wine bar was full. Children ran past in coats and scarves. The street was alive in the exact way I had imagined years ago when I stood here as the invisible owner dreaming of possibility. I felt a hand brush my sleeve. It was Tessa. "You did this," she said softly. I shook my head. "No, we all did. This place grew because people believed in it." She smiled the way a friend smiles when they know the truth you refuse to claim. Sometimes you forget who planted the first seed. We stood together on the sidewalk, watching the lights shimmer across the snow. For a moment, I felt the memory of that first night of revelation, when Dad learned the street he used to insult me had belonged to me all along. But the memory did not sting anymore. It simply existed like an old photograph stored in a drawer, something that mattered once but no longer shaped my days. I had not defeated him. I had not crushed him or proved anything in some grand dramatic way. I had just stepped out of the place he built for me, and that was enough to change everything. As the evening wore on, I walked the block one more time, letting the cold air wrap around me gently. My boots crunched softly through the snow. People brushed past me with warm greetings. The music drifted up the street like a soft river. This was a life I built with my own hands, a life I kept for myself. I paused near the corner of the square, where the lights formed a soft glow above the walkway. I looked up at them, let my breath curl in the air, and felt a peace so steady it almost startled me. For years I believed worth came from being useful, from being the glue that held everyone else together, from meeting expectations I never agreed to. But the truth was simpler than that. My worth had always existed. I had only needed the courage to claim it. As I walked toward the cafe to meet Tessa, the lights behind me shimmering like small stars, I felt a quiet truth settle inside me. Freedom is not loud. It does not rush in like a storm. It arrives slowly like dawn, touching everything it passes. And I was finally standing in the light of my own morning. Thank you so much for staying with me through my story. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.